All right, we're back for part 3 in our discussion of Joseph Smith and the seer stone that was photographs of which were recently published by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In part 1, we talked a bit about the cultural environment that Joseph Smith and his family grew up in and the tradition of folk magic that existed at that time, and followed Joseph Smith's acquisition of the stone and his early use of the stone leading up to his acquisition of the golden plates. In part 2, we talked about Joseph Smith using the stone both in the translation of the golden plates as well as a conduit for communication and revelation from God that kind of culminated in a revelation sending people to Canada for selling the copyright, which was a failed revelation that kind of was a mark of the beginning of the decline of Joseph's use of the stone. Our guests are Dan Vogel, historian Dan Vogel, and Christopher C. Smith, who we met in part 1 and part 2. How are you guys doing?
Great.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Oh, yeah. Well, we're very glad that you're willing to participate in this discussion, and it's great to have you back for part 3. Okay, so we've gotten to the point now where Joseph's use of the stone is starting to wane. There were a couple of events in the history of the stone that we didn't get a chance to cover, and we want to take some time to step back and look at those. And Dan, I think you had mentioned that one of the first of those was an incident regarding a treasure and a tail feather. What can you tell us about that?
All right. Well, before I describe that event, which was given by Josiah Stoll during the 1826 trial, we might summarize the possible interpretations of what we see in the record regarding Joseph Smith's treasure seeing, and that is that he's either a real treasure seer, and there were really slippery treasures that slipped through the earth, and they were enchanted, and Joseph Smith couldn't get them, or he was delusional, and that could be ruled out by this story by the tail feather I'll tell in a second. Or 3, Joseph Smith was just a con man, not sincere about treasure digging at all. Or 4, maybe a mixture of delusional and con man. So we can't rule out that maybe sometimes he may have seen things in his stone and had explanations for why he couldn't get them. But at other times he may have used deception to make his reputation grow and exceed his competitors. So the best evidence for some of the treasure seeing being of the deceptive conman variety comes from Josiah Stoll, a believer in Joseph Smith's gift, oddly. So during the 1826 trial, Joseph Smith tried to produce witnesses that would testify to his ability that he was a real treasure seer, and didn't violate the law where it said pretend to see in the ground or find lost objects. So Josiah Stoll says he knew Joseph Smith had this ability, and he gives one example. One was his remote viewing of his farm 150 miles away. Another one was of a dig that occurred where he describes Joseph Smith looked into a stone and said that there's a treasure off in some distant place, and that when it was buried, those who buried it put a tail feather on the lid of the trunk before they buried it, and it would be found near a tree, near a root, a stump of a tree near the root. So they went off and they started digging, and this is one of the rare instances where Josiah Stoll describes Joseph Smith participating in the dig. Says we dug and they dug. They got down so far, and they found this feather there, but the trunk kept settling away, according to Josiah Stoll, and they were never able to reach it. So this is an instance where a tail feather being 5 feet on the ground is not a common thing. It had to be put there on purpose. Either by the people that dug the treasure, and then you have to believe in slippery treasures, or by Joseph Smith, either in the process of digging or maybe a previous visit to the area. So that would be in the area of conscious deception, where a deluded seer could not do anything like that.
Hmm. So a deluded seer who maybe comes up with stories or visions in his head would not be able to come up with a specific detail like a tail feather that then would materialize.
Well, if they're deluded, they'll never find
You'll never
anything
find anything.
except by accident. Maybe they might find a salt mine or something, or water or whatever.
See, the dilemma that believers have is that there are accounts in the text of the Book of Mormon itself about slippery treasure or slippery hidden things. And so if you're a believer in the Book of Mormon, there's some credibility with that.
Well, they're stuck with the magic worldview in a way of a slippery treasure, seer stones in the Book of Mormon, things that you don't find in the Bible, but you find in Joseph Smith's environment and in the imaginary history of America.
See, when I first heard that story, I didn't realize that Joseph Smith went on the dig itself, because when I heard that, I thought, well, maybe that was something where he pre-buried a feather and then set them on that particular task. But it's entirely conceivable that if he was there, maybe he was the one who found the feather, and that would be something that would be very easy to kind of palm and make it look as though it was something that you found.
Well, of course we don't know exactly how it was performed. We only know Josiah Stoll's description as recorded by Judge Neely. But this is how it could occur, and Joseph Smith had a reputation. One of the things Joseph Smith's one of the people that participated in Joseph Smith's 1830 trial, Abraham W. Benton, who lived in South Bainbridge, where Josiah Stoll lived. He may have been at the 1826 trial, but at the very least he knew about the details of the 26 trial, because the 1830 trial brought all of that back up again, because he had not been convicted and he was doing it again, and so all this would be brought up again in 1830 trial.
Well, actually, this might be a good time for us to address that trial, because that was one of the things that we didn't get a chance to talk about. What was it precisely that brought Joseph again before a magistrate?
Well, he was again in South Bainbridge area in 1830, July 1830, and doing the same money digging, or he actually was doing the Book of Mormon, and the story of how the Book of Mormon came forth sounded like the same thing to them. So they brought up the trial again, because he brought forth the Book of Mormon through the same stone, and so
the narrative that Joseph was giving people at that point was that the stone was involved in the discovery of the Book of Mormon?
I'm sure it was spoken about, but
that was absolutely the narrative, yeah.
Yeah, and then certainly the witnesses of the translation, that was their account when they talked about the power that brought it into a being. It was through the stone with the face and the hat and so forth.
Right. And,
okay, so it had been published at this point before the trial? It actually, been on the bookshelves?
Well, in the 1830 trial, Oliver Cowdery testified, and when he testified that it was, he brought up the spectacles. Of course, we know that the Book of Mormon did not come forth from the spectacles, but Oliver Cowdery falsely testified that the Book of Mormon came from the spectacles, and it was a whole different thing, and therefore it didn't pertain to his former money digging the charges that he was able to escape in 1826. But they pled the statutes of limitations in South Bainbridge because it had been more than 3 years, and so they hauled him off down 10 miles south to Colesville, because he had been doing treasure seeing there also on the Joseph Knight Sr. farm in 1827 even. But
did they physically
so they tried
haul
to
him off there?
Well, yeah, he was with the constable. Constable took him there, and they tried him before Joe K. Noble, Justice Joe K. Noble. And Joe K. Noble wrote about various things in a letter that we have, a very early letter, and described some of the what was going on in the 1826 trial, and in that trial that was before him there in Colesville. But he again escaped the charges there, mostly probably because the Book of Mormon was translated in Pennsylvania and not in that county.
Jonathan, I was just going to say, long as we're talking about sort of evidence of fraud, maybe we should talk about the plates and sort of the evidence of fraud surrounding Joseph actually having plates.
Please, that's very interesting.
Yeah, so there's a neighbor of Joseph Smith who in 1834 gives an affidavit, and he says basically that, well, first of all, this is Peter Ingersoll, and Peter Ingersoll sort of portrays himself and Joseph Smith as like pranking buddies. And there's sort of family lore about Joseph Smith going and speaking in tongues at the district courthouse as a Methodist exhorter, and then coming back, and him and Peter Ingersoll sort of laughing about all these dupes and everything, laughing together about Joseph tricking Willard Chase into making him a chest and things of that nature. But according to Peter Ingersoll, Joseph Smith came to him one day, and he had this frock, and he said that he had sand in a frock, and he just sort of on a whim decided to pass this off as plates to his family, and they bought it. And Peter Ingersoll makes it sound like a really spur-of-the-moment thing, so there's some question about kind of the reliability of his account, but we do have accounts of Joseph Smith carrying the plates in a frock, coming home with the plates in a frock on at least one occasion. So that's one piece of evidence. Another piece of evidence is in one of the 1830 trial accounts, we're told that Josiah Stowell testified that he saw Joseph Smith with the plates under a sheet or a blanket, and a corner of the sheet was lifted, and so he saw a corner of the plates exposed, and it appeared to be a stone of a greenish cast. So that's another piece of evidence. And then a third piece of evidence.
His face didn't melt off like in the Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Wasn't there a dire warning about people seeing the plates actually with their eyes?
Yeah, you weren't supposed to see them sort of on pain of death. And the interesting thing about that is that Stoll was a believer in Joseph Smith's abilities. So assuming that this is an accurate account of his testimony, he seems to have, actually seen a corner of the plates exposed, and it looks like a stone of a greenish cast.
And he wasn't disconcerted that it wasn't golden?
The trial or the account doesn't make clear how he felt about this. It just sort of reports matter-of-factly this testimony. And then a third piece of evidence that suggests that Joseph may have just had an empty box that he was claiming had the plates in it is that one of their neighbors says that Emma Smith looked into the box on one occasion, and she was just peeking, and then Joseph Smith told her that a portion of the plates had disappeared because she had peeked.
Oh boy. That brings to mind Carl Sagan's demon-haunted world with the dragon in the garage, that no matter what you do, there's always an explanation why you can't find the evidence of it.
Right.
Interesting.
Well, I'm not sold on the green stone testimony, mostly because there is a whole group of other witnesses that have testified that they felt the weight of the plates, and they thumbed the leaves and heard a metallic sound. There's Emma Smith, who says she moved the plates when she was dusting, and she could hear them chink when she's setting them down, and she could ruffle the edges of these plates. So, and there's even non-believers who have hefted the box and felt the weight of the plates in the box. And Martin Harris reported that Alva Beeman, a fellow money digger, when he put the plates in this barrel of beans that Joseph Smith was trying to hide them in, he could hear the plates chink. And so I have argued that it would be no problem for Joseph Smith to construct a set of plates out of common tin. He said they were as thick as common tin, but tin was common, and they used it for all sorts of things, and even around the Smith farm and neighboring farms, and it would be no problem for Joseph Smith to gather up scrap pieces of tin, cut them to whatever size he needed, poke holes, 3 holes in the edge, put rods through them, and bend those rods into circles, rings, and allow people to feel them through the cloth, but not to see them. That's the whole reason for putting them into this cloth, was because they couldn't pass visual inspection. And there's no really good excuse for why no one could see them. I mean, we could see the papyri, the Egyptian papyri, the Kinderhook plates. We can see the stone. We can see the stone, but we can't see the Urim and Thummim or the spectacles. We can't see the plates, and that's a red flag for that there's these unusual constraints.
And it's funny because, like we talked about last time, if we were talking about, the gentleman that you described who is notorious for doing deceptions without any religious aspect of it in that area, and we were to describe this as one of his gambits, you'd say, of course it's a deception, and of course he's going to say that you can't look at him because he fabricated his own fake plates and he's trying to pass that con off. But because this is a revered religious figure who we're talking about things that are seminal events that are foundational for the faith, there's just this block in people being able to consider that degree of deception associated with Joseph Smith.
So using the dimensions Joseph Smith gave, like 6 inches thick by 8 inches long, 6 inches wide, of tin with that would have little gaps, between the plates. It wouldn't be a solid block, in other words, of tin. But estimating that size, it would come out to be about 60 pounds, which is Martin Harris and William Smith describe plates as weighing from between 40 and 60 pounds. And here's a little thing about Martin Harris. Like I was telling you before, some of the Joseph Smith's early followers thought they were so clever and smart that Joseph Smith couldn't fool them. But later on, when he was interviewed by Joel Tiffany in 1859, he said he knew Joseph Smith had these golden plates because the Smith family didn't have enough money to purchase gold or lead to make those plates. And that if they were gold or lead, they'd be way over 100 pounds. So Martin Harris, right in the same interview, says that they were like 50 to 60 pounds. So he doesn't really know how much gold would weigh, or lead even would weigh. He's just guessing,
If I can push back on that just a little bit, I would suggest a couple things. First of all, glass is another possibility, as how Joseph Smith could have had some kind of artifact that might have seemed like gold plates. And the reason that glass makes sense is because he is said to have kept the plates in a glass box the size of common window glass.
It wasn't a box made out of glass.
Right, it was a box for holding window glass.
Yeah, right.
And then secondly, I would suggest that Joseph could have used multiple props on different occasions. And then thirdly, there's sort of different weights given for the plates. There's somebody who says 30 pounds and there's somebody who says 13 pounds. I mean, this would just kind of like go toward the idea that there might have been multiple props that he used. With the barrel of beans, isn't there an account, Dan, you might remember this better than me, but of the money diggers kind of going and digging into the barrel of beans or digging underneath the barn or something looking for the plates, and then Joseph Smith claimed that he had moved them
Yeah.
that he had sort of been inspired to move them, and that's why they didn't find the plates where he said they were.
Right. Well, he hid the plates in the underneath, or in the loft, actually,
Okay.
in the cooper's shop, across
Yeah.
the
Okay.
street. It's across from the house, across the road, Stafford Road. In that field in front of the Joe Smith's house, there was a cooper's shop where his father worked, and he said he hid them among the flax in the loft. He took the box and he hid it underneath. So uh, how it appeared to the family when they discovered the box, they went into the cooper shop and the floor was torn up and the box was torn up, and they feared that the enemies had taken the plates. But Joseph said, no, I put the box underneath the floor, but I put the plates in the loft among the flax and the hay or whatever, and hid it. So they really didn't get it. So what you have is Sally Chase using her green colored seer stone, finding, and the stone works good enough to find the box, but not the plates.
Hold
It's
on a
very
second.
odd
This
story.
is so Sally Chase was employed as a scryer by these other people to try to find Joseph's plates. Wow,
Right.
that would make
And
a
so
great
my
movie.
reconstruction of it is that Joseph Smith is the one that destroyed the box when he went to hide it by himself in the cooper's shop, and he used that story as a way of saying it's very dangerous. Here we have to be vigilant, and it would unite his group against the enemy, and but
Which is
anyway,
a group manipulation technique that we would easily have fit in our discussion about those psychological manipulations that we had yesterday.
Right.
That makes sense.
I don't want to get too far off topic, but go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to say that my read of that situation has always been that the box was empty and that the money diggers really did find the box, got wind of where it was hidden and found it and dug it up and smashed the box, and there was nothing in it, and that Joseph's sort of post hoc rationalization for why there was nothing in the box was that he had been inspired to move the plates somewhere else. So
I wish we had
that's a possibility, except for he takes the plates and hides them underneath the hearth in the Smith home. He picks up the bricks, digs a hole in the ground and buries the plates and puts the bricks back in front of people. I mean, they saw
famously
that.
depicted in some church videos, if I recall. Actually, the topic of the plates is one that would deserve its own separate discussion. I think an analysis, particularly where there's a part at the end of the Book of Mormon where the author specifically says that a certain number of chapters encompass one side of one plate, and then you can take that language density and then project it over the rest of the Book of Mormon and try to come up with how many plates the whole Book of Mormon would take, and then look at the metallurgy of that. It actually comes up with some very interesting calculations, but we'll save that for a discussion focused on that particular part of it. So you mentioned that in the 1830 trial, not only did they bring back some of the testimony from the 1826 trial, but now there was new information regarding the acquisition of the plates and his translation of the plates. What other testimony, other than you mentioned that Oliver Cowdery also testified at the 1830 trial? Were there any other significant testimony or evidence brought forth at that trial that we did not see at the 1826 trial?
Well, they brought up the exorcism of Newell Knight, where Joe Smith cast the devil out of Newell Knight. They brought that up, and that someone saw the devil come out of Newell Knight and in a form of a rodent.
Yeller dog.
That's one. Yeah, one story says a yeller dog, another one says like a woodchuck or something. But scurry off,
Were such exorcisms uncommon or common? Was that part of the folk magic tradition?
Well,
more like the Protestant revivalist.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, if you ask, like,
It goes
my
back to
favorite
the
piece of trivia,
Puritans.
right? My favorite piece of trivia is, what was the first miracle performed in the new church? And it was, in fact, an exorcism, if I recall correctly.
I think it was this exorcism.
Oh, was this the one? Okay.
Yeah, April of 1830.
1830. Yeah. All right.
Uh, so, yeah, exorcism, and demonic possession, where Newell Knight goes into contortions on the floor, and looks like he levitates because of it, really because of the arching of the back, probably, but with the muscle spasms. And this goes back to Puritans have the stories just like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I've read accounts where in a religious fervor, in an environment where there's belief in those things, that you can see manifestations like that are just part of the psychological milieu that I think Pentecostals have some equivalent for as well. Maybe you could speak to your own experiences growing up Pentecostal, Chris.
Well, I certainly have heard these stories. I never witnessed anything like this directly myself, but I know people who have.
Okay.
Very similar things.
There was another event that, I guess, anything else on the 1830 trial?
No, there's not much really
Okay.
known. I mean, we don't have a transcript of it like we do for the 1826. We just have the, like I mentioned, Benton. Abraham W. Benton was the one that brought the charges against Joseph Smith, and then he gave the account in the local newspaper in 1831, which was, pretty quickly after the event. But during the trial, in his description of the trial, he also mentions that it is reported, and probably true, that Joseph Smith commenced his juggling by stealing and hiding property belonging to his neighbors, and when inquiry was made, he would look in his stone and tell where it was.
Okay. This then is where some of those things that you mentioned in our prior discussion about
Right.
perhaps him following the pattern of some of the other deceivers and hiding something that they had already acquired
right.
as proof. Okay.
Also, there's the Presbyterian minister, Jesse Townsend, who was Lucy Smith's minister for a while before he was replaced by Stockton. But he also said that Joseph Smith has a stone into which he placed his hat. When placed in a hat, he pretended to look and see chests of money buried in the earth. He was also a fortune teller, and he claimed to know where stolen goods went, probably too well.
I see. And that was also testimony offered at that 1830 trial?
This was 1833 statement, letter that he wrote to another minister in 1833, published by Pomeroy Tucker in his 1867 book. So, but we have two different accounts, two different,
two different corroborating sources that kind of give that narrative where Joseph may have stolen and then located to prove his power.
So there's always, a counter narrative going along with the believer's narrative.
Yeah. All right. There was another event that I hadn't heard about that I wondered if you could expand on, and that was Joseph using the stone as sort of a way to remotely view David Whitmer during some travels. What's the context there?
Right. So Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery are down in Harmony, Pennsylvania, translating the Book of Mormon in April and May 1829. And the situation there starts getting desperate too, with the persecutors and people bothering them, and so they want to change location. And before Oliver Cowdery came, he came from Manchester to meet. And the first time he met Joseph Smith, he had been a school teacher in Manchester and heard the story of the plates, and he wanted to meet Joseph Smith. So when the school season was over, he traveled down to Harmony, Pennsylvania to meet Joseph Smith, and then became his scribe. But on the way, he stopped and talked to the Whitmers, and he told David that he would write back and tell him what he found, because David Whitmer was interested in knowing the details. And so Oliver wrote a few letters, and in the process, they got permission to move to Peter Whitmer's Whitmer's farm to finish the translation. So they sent a letter and said, come down and pick us up. And David Whitmer left with a wagon to carry their belongings. And when he arrived in Harmony, Joseph was there to greet him along the road. And Oliver Cowdery was there. And then Joseph Smith revealed to him, these are stories David Whitmer told in later years, that Joseph Smith said, yeah, I saw you coming in my stone. I saw you stop by at this tavern. I saw you stop by the road here and read a sign. I saw, and he convinced David Whitmer that he had seen the whole trip. The thing is that David Whitmer is traveling on the Pennsylvania thoroughfare, and the major highway that runs south through New York and then across the northern Pennsylvania. And Joseph Smith's house is like very close to this road. And it's a very busy road. And David Whitmer's in this slow-moving wagon, and undoubtedly there's faster-moving people along that road on horses going by. Joseph Smith has an idea when he's going to arrive, and I imagine he just interviews people. It just says, did you see a guy coming in a wagon from Fayette, New York? And he gathered information, and he exploited that information. When I remember last time I mentioned you have to take control from the psychic, and the psychic can only perform when they have control. Well, Joseph Smith's in control of what he's telling people. I mean, it's not like David Whitmer says, "Oh, tell me what I did now. Tell me, tell me what I did on the way here." He wasn't asking the questions. Joseph Smith was giving him the reading. And the same thing when he met Josiah Stoll in 1825. He described the farm. He offered that as evidence.
Right. David
Whitmer didn't say, okay, prove to me that you have a gift. Describe my farm. That would be a whole different thing. So there is a similar situation that occurs. It's quite interesting when Joseph Smith's not in control. And it's while Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery this happened like previous to this. Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery are translating, doing the work of the translating of the Book of Mormon, and they run out of supplies, so they want to travel north up to Colesville to Joseph Knight Sr., who sponsors a lot of Joseph Smith's work, and they need his financial help. So they travel up the river for hours before they arrive and find out Joseph Knight Sr. is away on a business trip, and their trip was for nothing. So if Joseph Smith had this ability to see people from a distance, why didn't he just look in his stone and know where Joseph Knight Sr. was before they made this unnecessary trip?
That's a very good question.
He wasn't in control. He wasn't in control.
Yeah. It's just remarkable when you go back and re-look at these events from the skeptic's perspective, everything seems to make sense. If you look at these events from a believing perspective, the times where he's successful make sense, but then there's this conflict, this cognitive dissonance that you feel about all these other events, such as what you described. There was, other than that, I guess the other thing that is a significant event in the life of the use of this stone was within the church, competing seers that arose with their own stones and how Joseph handled that. Chris, do you have a handle on that? I think Hiram Page was one of them, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. Well, both Oliver Cowdery receives a revelation in 1829, which Joseph seems to have adapted as the Articles of the Church of Christ. I actually suspect that before Oliver received that revelation, Joseph didn't actually intend to create a church. I think Oliver is kind of the one who introduces the idea of creating a church. But
Are you
then,
talking about something that's like a early version of what turned into the Articles of Faith?
no, the Articles of the Church of Christ are not the Articles of Faith.
Okay, you're talking about the document that actually established the organization of the church.
Right, right.
Okay.
And then, yeah, there's Hiram Page in 1830 who receives his own revelations. And Joseph Smith receives a revelation which basically denounces Hiram Page's stone, says that it's not legitimate, his revelations are not legitimate, they're from the devil, and that only Joseph will from now on have the authorization to receive written revelations for the church. Now, other people at this point can still receive sort of verbal revelations, but they're not allowed to get written revelations. Only Joseph Smith from this time can do that.
When he got what were the content of his revelation, and what voice did those revelations come in? Did they come in like "Thus saith the Lord" type, or?
Unfortunately, the Hiram Page revelations are gone now. They were destroyed, and so we don't have them. But Hiram Page does give an account of having seen some angels, and he says that the angels spoke to him in the pure language, and we don't know whether he may have produced a translation of those tongues as one of his revelations, but it's hard to say.
The pure language you're talking about, the Adamic language, the original language?
Right.
It's interesting that topic comes up because we talked a little bit about John Dee and Ed Kelly, and one of the things that came up in their scrying activities was also this concept of the pure Adamic language. And it's interesting that seer stones, angelic communication, and that language comes up at both of these points. Dan, you were going to say something?
Well, Hiram Page had a stone, a black stone, and after Joseph Smith, and he got revelations through it. Someone described it as a whole like choir, or pretty good sizable stack of pages of revelations that had to do with the founding of Zion, and these are things that people were wanting to know about. Since the Book of Mormon talked about establishing the New Jerusalem, where was that going to be, And so Hiram Page was trying to fill that void, and then Joseph Smith condemned his revelations, and they destroyed that stone. They ground it into powder, and destroyed the revelations, evidently, also.
Did this happen at a time, I know when the church first started, it wasn't so much a hierarchy that we understand now, it was more of almost a religious anarchy, I guess, where people could have remarkable revelations and nobody seemed to have significant authority over the other. Is this where we start to see that authority come into place?
Yeah, up until this point, Joseph is really first among equals, and then about November 1830, I believe it was, he starts to sort of impose his own primacy as the revelator for the church.
And where do we find, I believe it's one of the Doctrine and Covenants sections where we find specifically addressing Hiram Page's stone, is that correct?
Yeah, I don't have that in front of me, but there is a DNC revelation on that.
Okay. I can put a link to that in the thing. Were there any other, you mentioned that Oliver Cowdery came up with the Articles of the Church. Did he receive those with the use of any magical artifact, or was that something that came directly to him through his mind?
I'm not really sure. He says in that revelation that he felt it as a fire in his bosom and that he just sort of had to get it out. And he uses similar language to describe his initial vision of the plates prior to coming and meeting Joseph Smith for the first time. So this seems to have been something that was sort of weighing on him, but I don't know whether he used the stone for it or not. Probably.
The interesting thing about that revelation, the reason why Cowdery is receiving that revelation is because he's disputing one of Joseph Smith's revelations.
Really?
And that would be Yeah, this is in June 1829, or 1830, excuse me. June 1830, right? Or no, it's 1829.
It's
Right.
1829.
So it was
So
before the organization.
29, yeah,
of the church.
June 1829. DNC 18 directs Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer to choose 12 disciples. Joseph Smith wants to set up, the disciples, it says, but they're apostles, and that Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer are to choose 12 apostles, and that the 12 apostles are to organize and build the church by ordaining priests and teachers, which leaves Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer out of the hierarchy and building the church. So Oliver Cowdery then issues this revelation that Chris is talking about, that says that Oliver Cowdery is an apostle himself. And he's an apostle because he's seen the plates and the Lord showed him the plates. He's an apostle already. He's also, one of the three witnesses. So Oliver Cowdery is an apostle, and Oliver Cowdery is to ordain priests and teachers, not these 12 disciples. So that puts Oliver Cowdery still in the hierarchy kind of the church instead of being left out of it. But
and that's still taking the concept of apostle as somebody who has seen with their own eyes and goes forth and bears testimony of it, and so that naturally he would fit that role. So when Joseph Smith issues his Articles and Covenants of the Church of Christ, which is now DNC 20, he does not found it with 12 apostles. He compromises and says that an elder is an apostle. And so the elders saw themselves as, all the elders saw themselves as apostles. And basically there were 12 Book of Mormon apostles, you might call it. But many of whom had the same names as the the New Testament apostles, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, an elder is an apostle, and so the church was founded without apostles, and the apostles weren't organized until February 1835.
Well, that's a fascinating chapter. I know that the explanation for that is, well, they messed up a little bit. They learned how the church was supposed to be organized, precept upon precept and line upon line. So there are good explanations for why they may have stumbled a little bit there, and we won't hold them against them. But it's very interesting to see that Oliver Cowdery
Jonathan, we're getting some major feedback from your mic. I'm not sure.
Okay, let's see what I can do to fix that. One question that I had, Chris, before we go on to the next topic is...
it's really bad. We can barely hear you. Okay, are you getting feedback too? Dan, are you getting feedback too?
I can hear it. It's breaking up your voice, and there's a little static all the time.
Yeah.
Well, I will not talk much. My question real quick, if you're able to understand
How's your bandwidth?
It should be good.
Okay.
If AT&T is to be believed.
Maybe you should hang up and rejoin. Or
yeah, let me try that. I'll see if
Ask
I can
a question.
do that. The question was Joseph Smith giving revelations without the stone at the time that Oliver Cowdery seemed to get this revelation possibly without a stone? Or did Oliver Cowdery set that pattern?
Yeah. Joseph Smith was still using his stone.
Yeah, I don't remember when that stopped. Do you remember when that stopped, Dan? David Whitmer says.
Oh, okay. Well, David Whitmer says that it was in the spring of 1830.
Okay.
But he said it was the spring of 1830 that Joseph Smith gave the stone to Oliver Cowdery. However, there are revelations, like I mentioned before, to Orson Pratt after that, where the stone is being used. So David Whitmer might be off. He's off on some of his chronology a lot. And he confuses a lot of historians with some of his claims because he has the chronology off. But yeah, the spring. So Oliver Cowdery supposedly got the stone about that time. He did get it eventually. And let's do a little history of what happens to the stone right now. So he goes, Oliver Cowdery gets that in the printer's manuscript, and he hangs on to it, and then he gets excommunicated in 1838, and then he still has it. He lives in Richmond, Missouri, near David Whitmer, and he rejoins the church in 1849, but dies in 1850. And then shortly after that, his widow, Elizabeth Ann Whitmer Cowdery, who was a sister of David Whitmer, his widow gave the stone to Phineas Young, and Brigham Young's older brother. And Phineas Young takes it back to Utah and eventually gives it to Brigham Young. Then Brigham Young has it until his death in 1877. And then this is a part of the story I didn't know, is somehow Zina Huntington Young, a plural wife of Brigham Young, had to buy the two seer stones, from his estate after his death. And they know this because there's a little card with a note in the box in which the stone and the little sack that it came with, said to be made by Emma, are kept in the archives. So I didn't know that she had to buy it back, but then she donated it to the church, or to president of the church, who was John Taylor, and it was seen in John Taylor's possession. And then at some point, I forget what exact date, but Wilford Woodruff takes it and consecrates the stone on the altar of the Manti Temple. But it's remained in the church archives until now, until they release the photos. And
there we go. Well, thank you for that chronology. Chris, one of the things that you had mentioned was how Joseph Smith portrayed the stone in his histories. We've now seen kind of how the stone has moved over time. How was it portrayed by Joseph Smith in his early histories?
Right, so the sort of revision of all of this narrative begins with the story of the 116 pages. And so in the previous podcast, we talked about how Samuel T. Lawrence was the one who comes up with the idea of the spectacles sometime in the mid-1820s. But when Martin Harris goes to visit Charles Anton in New York City, he has this conversation with Anton where he apparently asked Anton to look at the characters and kind of give a translation of them, and Anton tries to, but he doesn't really understand them. But Anton asks to see the original, and he says, if I can see the plates, then maybe I can give you some kind of translation. And Martin Harris says that he's forbidden to produce the plates, and so Anton says, well, then I can't help you. And when Martin Harris gets back to Joseph Smith, back to Harmony, Pennsylvania, Joseph tells him that this trip has fulfilled a prophecy in Isaiah. And the prophecy says, and the vision of all is become unto you as the words of a book that is sealed, which men deliver to one that is learned, saying, read this, I pray thee. And he saith, I cannot, for it is sealed. And the book is delivered to him that is not learned, saying, read this, I pray thee. And he saith, I am not learned. So in other words, he can't read it. And so in order to kind of make this, make the story of the Book of Mormon translation fit this prophecy, Joseph Smith starts telling the story as if he didn't know about the spectacles. He didn't have any way to translate the plates until after Martin returned from visiting with Charles Anton, because the sort of last thing in that prophecy is that the book is delivered to one who has not learned, and he says, I am not learned. So in other words, implying that he has no way to read the book. And so Joseph Smith has to sort of rearrange the sequence of events to make it fit the prophecy. And he tells his story in the language of the prophecy. He narrates Martin's discussion with Anthon in the language of the prophecy, and basically makes it out to be, so when he tells the story in his 1832 history, he says, Martin returned to me and gave them to me to translate, the plates to me to translate. And I said, I cannot, for I am not learned. But the Lord had prepared spectacles to read the book, therefore I commenced translating the characters. And there are several other people who tell the story this way and make it sound like Joseph was surprised to discover that there were spectacles after Martin returns from Anthon. So this telling of the story kind of obscures Joseph's prior knowledge of the spectacles, and it, in doing so, it removes Samuel T. Lawrence from the story. It erases the magical origin of the spectacles and makes them seem to have sort of appeared and been provided miraculously after the Anthon episode. So that's sort of the first stage in the revision of this story. And then in the 1839 history, Joseph kind of returns to the original sequence of events. In this version, though, instead of Samuel T. Lawrence introducing the idea of the spectacles, it's the angel of Moroni who introduces him to the spectacles in 1823. And in order to maintain the link with the Isaiah prophecy, now that the sequence of events doesn't match, he has to introduce new words into Anthon's mouth, and so Anthon is made to say, I cannot read a sealed book, which are words lifted from the Isaiah prophecy. And so famously, Anthon is supposed to have said that, but he actually probably, well, certainly did not say that.
I would add just a little more clarification that in the 1832 account, the learned cannot read the words of the sealed book. And so Isaiah is fulfilled by them not being able to. And some early newspaper accounts say that Harris returned from his visit with Anthon, knowing that Joseph Smith was a little smarter than Anthon, and that he knew Joseph Smith had the gift because the learned could not translate the words. So in 1838, he wants the learned to verify his gift of translating. 1838 is after he's translated the Egyptian papyri. In the Egyptian papyri, he tries to make the learned verify his gift there also. In the Messenger and Advocate, they have the Chandler, the young man that is bringing the papyri to Joseph Smith, trying to sell it to him. They have him sign an affidavit. Of course, he's interested in selling it, so I'm not sure what I would believe everything the guy's writing, but he writes it. Joseph Smith's translation is verified by all the learned that he had previously visited, and that it coincided to their translation. So there is Joseph Smith's already showing that he wants more proof for his gift of translating. So when he tells the Anthon story in 1838, he says that not only did he send characters, he sent translation, and that Anthon verified his translation, which Anthon could not do. There's no way on earth that Anthon could verify any Egyptian translation at that time. So Joseph Smith is not telling the story accurately, and since he has Anthon verify his ability to translate, he has to change the way in which Isaiah is fulfilled. It can no longer be fulfilled because the learned can't read the book and the unlearned can. So he awkwardly puts the words of Isaiah right into Anthon's mouth. Oh, I cannot read a sealed book. You know, well, Martin Harris would have said only a portion of them was sealed, but if he knew that a portion of them were sealed at that time, and Anthon could have said, well, bring the unsealed portion to me then.
Yeah, it's interesting when you read Anthon describe that incident. He seems to be just like absolute. I mean, it's like it's obvious that this farm guy that came and talked to me is the victim of a fraud, and that's just another example where when you look at it without the emotionally charged atmosphere of the religious environment, that it's a lot easier to see these things for what they are.
Mm-hmm. So there's another important development here that I want to talk about, and that's how the spectacles become the Urim and Thummim. And so this seems to have happened in 1832. The first time that Urim and Thummim is applied to the spectacles is August 5th, 1832. Orson Hyde and Samuel Smith are preaching in Boston, and they say that the Book of Mormon translation was made known by the Spirit of the Lord through the medium of the Urim and Thummim. The same as were used by the prophets of old, which were two crystal stones placed in bows, something in the form of spectacles, which were found with the plates. And then, but then in the 1833 Evening and Morning Star, this still seems to be kind of like a speculative interpretation, and it says that the Book of Mormon was translated with the Urim and Thummim, or as the Nephites would have said, oh, sorry, that was the wrong one. The Book of Mormon was translated by the gift and power of God by an unlearned man through the aid of a pair of interpreters or spectacles, known perhaps in ancient days as teraphim or Urim and Thummim. Now, teraphim is sort of like an Old Testament term for like idols that were sometimes used in divination. The Old Testament is not in favor of teraphim, but so here Urim and Thummim is suggested as a possible interpretation of what these spectacles were. And then by 1834, Oliver Cowdery includes it as fact in his history, and in 1835 it ends up in the Doctrine and Covenants. So between 1832 and 1835 is when this development happens and the spectacles become the Urim and Thummim. And as part of that process, they become attached to the breastplate. And Joseph Smith had talked about the breastplate as early as 1830, maybe as early as 1829. But he talks about sort of the gold sword and the gold breastplate. He tells Willard Chase, in a few years you will see Joseph Smith walking down the streets of Palmyra with a gold Bible under his arm and a gold breastplate on and a gold sword in his hand. And so at this point he probably viewed them as military artifacts. But in the Old Testament, the Urim and Thummim are placed inside the breastplate of judgment worn by the high priest. And so Joseph Smith now in 1839 invents the idea that there's two stones and silver bows that are put in the breastplate, which echoes the language of Genesis, but then he crosses out the put in and he says they're fastened to a breastplate. And so from this point on, people talk about the spectacles being attached to the breastplate by a rod, which would hold the spectacles in front of the seer's eyes. And so now the breastplate is transformed into a priestly artifact, and people call it Aaron's breastplate from this point on.
Dan, I think one of your videos mentions that it was mainly William Smith that invoked that concept. Is that true?
Are you talking to me?
Yes.
Okay. You guys are fading out.
Sorry,
William Smith does evoke that concept.
Yeah, William Smith gives the most detailed description of this breastplate, which he probably obviously got from Joseph Smith. But yeah, Chris did a good job of summarizing all that. In the Revelation D&C 17, when it lists the objects that the three witnesses are going to see, it says it links the breastplate with the sword of Laban that Nephi got when he killed Laban to get the breastplates, and he put on Laban's armor. So yes, the I believe the breastplate has been repurposed, and put into the category of the Urim and Thummim instead of in the category with the sword. Chris did that really nicely.
And that's why you see, anytime the church depicts the Urim and Thummim now, you see the picture of the high priest with the colorful gems on the breastplate, linking it with that aspect.
Yeah, the best guess of what the Urim and Thummim were is that one was white, one was black.
You mean in the Bible?
Yeah, in the Bible.
Right.
Yeah, right, thanks. Is that one was black, one was white, and they drew them out of the pocket. They would ask a yes and no question, and then they would draw one out of the pocket for the answer.
Oh, sort of like a casting lots or
yeah.
Something like that. And that's a far cry from seeing words and lights coming from it. It's interesting.
To say that the Old Testament instrument was anything like the spectacles in the Book of Mormon, that the Jaredites are the ones that supposedly constructed this Urim and Thummim, the spectacles. To say that has anything to do with the Old Testament is bizarre.
Yeah, I think that's where some people accuse Joseph of having a poor understanding of the rich biblical history that exists, and kind of just a superficial Protestant understanding, I guess, of the time frame. Go ahead, Chris.
There's an important additional development here, which is that now, because the spectacles are the Urim and Thummim, there's the question of why Joseph Smith didn't actually use them to translate the Book of Mormon. Why did he prefer to use a seerstone when he had the biblical Urim and Thummim available to him? This becomes a real embarrassment, and so they have to come up with explanations for why this happened. And a number of the witnesses come up with the idea, which I actually don't know when this story originated, but they come up with the idea that after the loss of the 116 pages, the Urim and Thummim were taken away as a punishment. And so the entire book of Lehi was translated with the Urim and Thummim, with the spectacles. And then Joseph Smith transitions to the seerstone after the loss of the 116 pages. But Joseph's version of the story is actually to conflate both the spectacles and his seerstone under the title of Urim and Thummim, and to make no distinction between the two. And he does this in his 1838 or 39. I'm not sure. You dated 1839 in your early Mormon documents, Dan, but you're saying 1838 now. But anyway, and that...
I say 1838 because the early portion was dictated, and I believe it was just copied without any changes, because when it says that he delivered the plates up to the angel, and he has them until this day, May, whatever, 1838. So it was copied without any changes, as far as I can tell, and it was originally written in 1838, but copied by Mulholland in 1839 into that draft that we don't have the beginning, but we have where it abruptly starts, but. Okay. So that's why I say the 1838, but the actual text that we have was written in 1839.
Okay. Well, anyway, in that history, Joseph Smith, he does say that the Urim and Thummim were taken away after the loss of 116 pages, but then he says that the Urim and Thummim were returned to him, and that he continued translating the rest of the Book of Mormon with the Urim and Thummim. So he makes it sound like the entire Book of Mormon was translated with the Urim and Thummim. And William McClellan really objects to this. He just thinks that this is all a lie. And David Whitmer is at least uncomfortable enough with this telling of the story to say that Joseph Smith translated the first portion of the Book of Mormon with the Urim and Thummim, but then the Urim and Thummim was taken away, and he was given another Urim and Thummim, which was a seerstone. And so David Whitmer sort of distinguishes between two different Urim and Thummims. But it's interesting that this has become sort of the standard narrative. The distinction between spectacles and stone kind of disappear as a result of this 1838 history that Joseph Smith writes.
Yeah, and you know, we as later Mormons, if we go back and we start nitpicking about that, the message that's given to us is that you know, that those details aren't really that important, and the whole thing is it's just the gift and power of God. That's all you need to know. And then by using the word Urim and Thummim, we're tied back into biblical stuff, and it's more of that psychological manipulation where then people are forced to reject the Bible if they reject Joseph's power, and it's a very effective technique for keeping people in a believing frame of mind.
So
and
I
it's
would
interesting. I was just going to say it's interesting to watch the witnesses wrestle with all of these different versions of the story. I mean, they will tell the story differently on different occasions depending on you know, whether they're emphasizing sort of their own memories or official church narrative. You'll get different stories.
What were you going to say, Dan?
I would add to Chris's account of the history obscures the seer stone by using the term Urim and Thummim for whatever situation, and even situations where we know that he's using the stone. So it gets really awkward for Joseph Smith to do this when it comes to how he received DNC 3 after the loss of the 116 pages. In his narrative, he has the Urim and Thummim taken away from him, but then the angel gives him back the Urim and Thummim so he can receive the revelation, and then takes him away again. When he had the seer stone the whole time, he could have just received the revelation through the seer stone, and or the angel could have just told him what the message was. But so it's a very awkward and manipulative history.
Well, it also points out how the whole technology of revelation seemed to be evolving at that time, where just a few years later it would not be unusual for Joseph simply to receive a revelation, direct communication from God without the assistance of anything at all. But I guess he didn't feel confident enough for that to be believed at the time. I don't know. Let's see. What do you guys, one of the things that was brought up by, I think both Bushman and Quinn mentioned, is that we shouldn't be too upset about some of the things that we might see where general authorities or leaders in the past have been unaware of the nature of the stone and its position in relation to translation. You know, we're told that they're raised with the same seminary and institute, and that never covered it, so we shouldn't really hold it against it. How familiar do we think church leaders were with this stuff?
Well, historically, I think they've been fairly familiar, but recently, I think not so much. Dan, go ahead.
How historically do you think? Like how?
Well, you know, I'm like, history's my life.
Yeah.
And so then to judge everybody else's knowledge against all the time and effort I put into it is just not fair. But even as a kid, I was dismayed by how little the adults around me seemed to know. But they're kept pretty busy, and they just try to teach what the manual instructs them to teach, and some of them try to pick up a few things. But you know, it's just not fair, really, to judge. The general authorities probably have less time than anybody to learn this stuff, and if they didn't learn it before, and some of them are different, but they're not general authorities because of their great knowledge of doctrine and history and theology. They're administrators.
That's why we see a lot of them coming from the business world and the legal world, not necessarily from the history world.
Right, that's their talent.
Yeah, we're lucky if we can actually get a historian in the church historian office. So
we did have one at one time.
Yeah, Arrington, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and that
didn't do so well.
Yeah, that stopped prematurely. But maybe we're seeing some of the fruit that of the seeds that he planted back then, because I think this new era of openness, you know, if we continue along the same trajectory, then you know, there's some difficult, challenging things that the church is going to have to deal with. And so we'll see how that plays out. All right, any closing thoughts? I think we've covered most of the things that I had on my slate to cover. If there's anything else that you guys have regarding the peepstone, now's the time. Chris, anything else? Any parting words?
No, I don't think so.
All right. What about you, Dan?
Just thanks
All right.
for publishing the photos.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for publishing the photos. Now I can, die a happy historian.
Okay, so Dan, just what of the things that you're aware of that may be in the church vaults, what is the thing that you are most eager to see before you shuffle off this mortal coil?
Okay, well, I thought I'd never get to see a photo of the Seer stone, but it's coming up. It's the Council of 50 Minutes. I'm very excited about the release of those, and it's probably anticlimactic, denying people to see it, and then you get to see it, and it'll be very interesting, of course, but it won't be as salacious as maybe some people imagine.
That we've heard, a lot of rumors about that is going to come down the pipe. For me, based on some people who have written about it already, who've had exposure to it, I find the kind of the parliamentary procedure that's described and set forth in those is going to be very interesting, because it amounts to complete totalitarianism. I mean, the person that's in charge of that group, if you disagree with them, you're out of the group. And when you just look at the logic behind how decisions are made there, it's very revealing. If you say this is how God's kingdom on earth is going to be run, it's very much a theocracy. And so you better be sure that the person in charge is, in fact, who he says he is. Anyway, I want to thank Christopher Smith and Dan Vogel for taking time out of their lives to have this discussion. I've learned a great deal, and I'm eager to share this with other people who are interested in hearing and learning more. And if we get some good feedback, it might be fun to have you guys back on another topic one day. All right.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Take care.